Hello. This is a continuation, the third of three, on the topic of security, know how to configure authentication and authorization. And the first thing we're going to do is do a quick sidebar. We've been kind of looking at seeing this config map business floating around, and I thought we'd take a minute just to make sure we understand it. So again, Kubernetes, at its core, right, is about storing these persistent objects, or one of the things it's about. And one of these persistent objects we can store are called config maps. And they had nothing to do with running clusters. They're just basically data structures for holding key value pairs. And it's not storing confidential data. It's like kind of more publicly visible key value pairs that you might use in your configuration somewhere else. And we'll talk about how to use them later. We just want to just create them, and we're going to use them to illustrate authentication or more authorization. Now, I think the easiest way of looking at these is just seeing how we create one. So let's go ahead and let me edit. There's a file called example.cm. And so this is, in the next video, I think we're going to get more into these configuration files, but if you just squint at it, it's pretty clear. This is part of the API group, which is the core group. So that's what the first line is. It's a config map. Its name is example, right? And data in this case is basically the key value pairs themselves. And it's the keys are essentially strings and the values are strings. So the first one is just the string is hello and the value is world, the string world. What's a little tricky is you can actually do multi-line values, right? So the key here is multi, and this is YAML syntax for providing a multi-line string, starting with hello and world. So this is just a multi-line string of hello world. And then the next one is just because the structure of what's the multi-line doesn't matter. So you can see this looks kind of like YAML a little bit with these dashes. And the third one, just to show you that you can put anything you want in that multi-line string. This looks a lot like JSON, right? Again, it's really just unstructured string. And so to apply this, we can do and just so you know, also, this is a namespace object, and because it didn't supply namespace, it's going to show up in the default namespace. So if I do cube control apply -f example, that should create a new configuration object, or a config map, right? And so if I do cube control get config map, I should see it in the default namespace, right? And if I want to describe it, or get more detail on it, I can do describe. And if you look at it carefully, its name is the name is example. It's in a default namespace. The data consists of, in no particular order, key value pairs. The key here, for example, other multi. The data looks like just two things, dog and cat. Hello, there's hello world. There's multi, hello world, just no structure. And then yet another multi, and it looks like JSON. So when you think about these things, just think of them as objects that hold basically a set of key value pairs. Okay, so with that in mind, we're going to use that later in our example. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is I'm just going to kind of do a setup of what's in terms of the users, right? So we're going to do authorization, and we're going to use multiple users. So the users we're going to use, and I've already pre-created these in Identity Access Management, but for the purposes here, let's look at them real quick. So I have a new user called Susie Admin, right, administrator, and that user we're going to basically have a user that can do administrative tasks, just like FruitEdit does, except for Susie is going to be constrained to do that administrative work on a particular namespace. Okay, and then Susie will have a second account called Susie, which is like her non-admin account that she might use for development. So we're going to have another user and we'll give Susie a different set of permissions. And then we create another one called Dave, and that's just a regular developer, just to flush it out, just another user that will have some access. Okay. Now, in terms of how to, let's see if I can visualize this. So what we're going to do here is imagine this is the organizational structure we have in our mind, right? Well, and again, this kind of teased at is we're going to have a concept of a new team, right? And in that team, we're going to think of there's administrators of the team. In this case, the Susie.administrator account that we're going to create, right? Well, that already created in IAM. When they log in as that, they'll be able to administer whatever that means, administer the team. And then there'll be two developers, one called Sue, and we'll associate the IAM account Susie and Dave to this concept of being a developer on this team, right? And presumably the admin, you have a lot of rights, including managing the permissions and authorization, right? And as a developer, you just pretty much can do whatever you're been delegated to do. So I think that's what this says. An admin can pretty much do anything in the associated namespace here, including managing authorization, whereas developers can, and out of the box, we're just going to give developers the ability to view everything in the namespace, and then we're going to delegate particular functions to just one of these developers, is what we're going to do. So the first thing we need to do is create a namespace, okay? And we're going to do it with a command line option here, or command line way of doing it. Cube control, create namespace A. Okay, so we got a namespace, and the namespace is literally named A. So if I say cube get name, I think maybe NS should work. Yeah, there's an A, right? Okay. Now let's look at, there's going to be two YAML files we're going to look at here, so let me look at them both. So there's one called aadmin and adeveloper. Let's look at the aadmin first. So this is kind of going back to what we did last time, right? We're going to use, let's see if I can get this right. So previously, there was a cluster role, remember, that was defined by default called admin. And admin gave you all sorts of rights to Kubernetes, but you can't change the namespace itself, right? So it's, the intention here is this admin role or cluster role is designed to delegate a person to do be like a sub-admin, right? So I didn't have to create this cluster role, that was a built-in one, okay? And what we're going to do is we're going to create a group, okay, so that's it. And then we're going to associate this with the groups. Again, this is the string, and I'm going to just arbitrarily, or not arbitrarily, but I'm going to call it a:\admin. The colon doesn't mean anything, it's just, in my mind, it's an easy way to organize my group, right? So it's the A team's admin, right? And any user that's associated with a.admin then is got a binding to be an admin, right? Now the key here is this is a role binding, so this only applies to the namespace A. So this basically means is that anybody who has a:\admin as part of their credentials, right, as a group, they will be now admins of the namespace A. That's how you read this. Okay, so probably repetitive there, but so if I do cube control apply -f a:\admin, that will create the cluster role, no, the role binding, right, that does that. Okay. Another one is a.developer. Now, if you remember before, there was also a predefined cluster role called view that lets you just, irrespective of namespaces, let you view objects. Okay. In this case, I'm associating it to a name of a group called a:\developer. Again, the colon has no special meaning here. It's just part of the name. And it's part of the namespace A. So if I give anybody, any user, any identity has a:\developer as a group, they will now be able to view anything in the namespace A. Okay, so that's that one. So I should apply that one. Okay, so if I do cube control Get cluster, no, role binding, oof. And then I have to do a namespace A. I should see the two, right? A, there's developer and admin. Okay, so that was a pre-set up. So that conceptually, when I create a new team, I had to create the namespace, and I have to create these two bindings. Okay. Now, now that I've got that set up, let's bring these users into the organization. So let's say we want to make sure we bring in the 3 users we created and assign them appropriately to their roles. So this would be, in my mind, I'm imagining this is like HR. Every time there's onboarding a new person in my organization, this this gets applied based on their roles in the organization. Are they administrator of a team, or maybe are they developer on the team? Okay. Again, this is just an imagined organization. So the way we're going to do this is there's a master object we're going to edit here, or not a master, but a core object. So this is a cube. Let me just edit it and we'll talk about it. Edit config map. So it's a config map we're editing. AWS, and we've done this before, but we're going to do it again. And this is part of the cube system. Right? So this is a kind of a central config map. And right, so previously we had given Fred the system masters group, right? So let me copy and paste, and then we'll look at what all this is. So let me copy and paste this in, and paste, and then I'm going to get rid of the old. I don't really need this I don't need this Fred mapping. Okay, so basically I just replaced the map users, right? And this is this is an example of a multi-line string, right? And it just happens to look kind of like YAML, although it's just arbitrary string, right? But in this case, it needs to be the structure, because this tool or this usage demands the structure, right? So the first thing is, this is Susie Administrator, and you see that we're assigning Susie Administrator the username Susie Administrator, but more importantly, she's getting the admin group name, which then that binding applies to, and she gets then essentially open access to that namespace. And then for Susie and Dave, they both are getting just the developer group, and so they'll be able to just view, based on that binding, they're able to just view everything in that namespace. And that's right. So that's basically this. So I save that, and okay. So now, essentially, that's the work that's done, sort of one time, whenever, or just kind of organizationally, what are their roles? Okay. Now, what we're going to do now is we're going to take a quick sidebar into what are, let me go over here and find it. So far, if you recall, let's see if I can get this right. Previously, we've talked about cluster roles, right? Which are basically a group of permissions, but it has nothing to do with the namespace. It's just a group of permissions. And then we used cluster role bindings or role bindings, right, to associate that cluster role to either to be cluster-wide with a cluster role, or to a role binding, and in that case it was just scoped to a namespace, right? But there's another concept just called role, but it's very similar to a cluster role. It also has permissions, just like a cluster role, right? So it's virtually identical, except for it can only be used in a particular namespace. So when you create a role, it's in a namespace, and it then provides permissions, and it can only then be used in that one particular namespace, right? So if you set it for namespace A, you're not going to be able to use it in namespace B, right? Now, at first, I was very confused about why did I need another concept, right? Because I could have just taken a cluster role, right, and just assign it through a binding, to a role binding, to a particular namespace, and it's that. Then I've created a binding that that cluster role only pertains to. It seems like the need for a role seems to be irrelevant or redundant. Now, it turns out that it is particularly useful, and I'll try to see if I can explain it properly here. So in this case, I want Susie administrator to be able to manage authorizations within her namespace, right? The problem here is if we didn't have a concept of role, we only had cluster roles, right? Cluster roles are not namespaced. So right now, she would not have the ability to create cluster roles to manage things because those are not in the namespace of A, right? So this is kind of a workaround because roles are namespaced to A, right? Susie, administrator, can now create roles all day long, and then she can use those to grant access for different people to things. So it's basically, in my mind, role is essentially the same thing as a cluster role, but it's scoped to a namespace, which allows an administrator of that namespace to use it or create them. So that took me a while to get that in my head straight. Hopefully I explained it properly. So we're going to have Susie use one of these things. So the first thing we need to do is log in as Susie administrator, and we're going to imagine that I'm Susie administrator now, and I'm setting up my team, and I'm trying to maybe delegate some work. So the first thing I need to do is log in as Susie administrator, and I should have done this. Oh well. Okay, let's do it. AWS to-dos, RS, AWS. So again, this is you're going to use so this is AWS configure, right? But I don't want to expose my keys. So I'm going to pause the video for a second and log in as Susie administrator. Okay, we're back. So I'm logged in as Susie.administrator now, and we can validate that by running the AWS STS get call identity call. And you can see, indeed, I'm now Susie administrator, right? And what I probably should do is open up another window and go into, CD documents. I go back into the KS, CKA, and I go into my examples. Okay, so, because I'm going to run some of these config files. So the first thing I want to do is recognize that Susie right now, so I'm Susie right now, she should only have access to the A namespace. So for example, if she tries to run, let's see if I can get this right, get, right? And if I just run this, it's in default to the namespace default, which Susie has no access. So you notice it says, hey, I can't basically do anything in this space. Yet if I do the same thing with the namespace of A, I at least get back that there's no resources, so I don't get an error. So that illustrates the fact that Susie pretty much can't do anything outside the A namespace. Okay. Okay. The next thing what we can do is, because she's administrator, she can pretty much do what she wants in that namespace. So let's look at I have this example of a fruit, just to be, I don't know, funny. afruit.cm.yaml. So what this is a config map, right? And it's fruit named fruit. It's in namespace A, and the data is just A and then apple and B banana. Something super simple, right? And so as Susie, administrator, I'm going to create this config map. So kube control apply -f a.fruit.cm.yaml, right? And indeed, I can see it's there. So if I could do kube control describe fruit config map fruit namespace A, right? There's my data, A for apple, B for banana. Okay. Okay, so now I've got this config map. As Susie, I decided I want to be able to delegate out who can basically edit this fruit, right? Everybody in the team, so that would mean any user, which would have been Susie and Dave, should be able to read this, but we didn't give edit rights. So she wants to create the ability for certain team members to be able to edit this config map, right? So there is a dot, bear with me, here, oh yeah, there's a fruit role. A fruit, and it sounds funny when I say it, but okay. So what I'm doing here now is I am creating a role, right? That now this is a role, right? Because this is a namespace object, she can Susie administrator can create these. If it was a cluster role, she would not be able to, right? So here it is. She's creating a role in the namespace A, and it's named. And again, the colon here doesn't mean anything. It's just I'm just naming it for my own convenience. It's basically a fruit editor. So anybody who has this role, right, will be able to do what? If you look at the API groups are, because it's blank, it's the core group. The resources are it's basically we're operating on config maps. It has to be named fruit, and they can do a get, which is essentially a read, but a patch, which is an update, and so is update. So basically they can edit the fruit config map in the namespace A if you have this role, okay? So let's apply that first. Cube control. Okay, I think I got that right. Okay. So if I describe it, let's see, kube control get role. Actually, I want to describe the role. Describe role fruit edit namespace A. Hopefully I got that right. Yeah, it does work, right. So basically the rule here basically says it operates on config maps that are only named fruit, right? So if I had a different config map in the same namespace, it would not work. This wouldn't apply. And I could do a get, patch, and update verbs on that config map. Okay. And it's tied to the namespace somewhere up here. I guess it doesn't list the namespace, but the namespace is A, right? Okay. So next thing, that just creates the the role, which is like the permissions, right? It doesn't assign to anybody. So the next thing I need to do is assign this to somebody, and that's where, or bind it. So there's a fruit role binding, right? And because this is a namespace object, she can now create it still, right? It's in namespace A, and it's tied to that role I just created, so FruitEdit, right? So, and the last piece of this is she has to, she wants to delegate this to Susie. So she says, Susie is given this, is bound. So whenever the user with the user name Susie logs in, Susie then is bound to the role FruitEdit, which then means that Susie can edit it. But Dave right now will not be able to because Dave wasn't given this right. Dave could read it but not write it, right? Now, one thing a little confusing here is in the previous examples, we were doing role bindings to groups, right? So we would actually create the group and then we'd do a role binding to it. And here it looks like we're doing role bindings to users. This is because Susie, right, doesn't have the ability to create new groups in the system because she's not an administrator, she's not in the HR department, she can't like get after that other config map that manages the groups. So she doesn't have the ability to create groups, so she can manage who has access to this directly by adding users directly. So there might be a better way, I'm not aware of it though. So this is how Susie administrator will have to manage who can edit the fruit config map. Okay, so let's apply this. Fruit role binding And we can describe it too. Cube, describe. This is so many words very similar. This is a role binding. And then this is FruitEdit in the namespace A. Hopefully I got that right. Yeah, I get it right. So what does this say? It's hard to read that. I'm going to run it again. Okay, so here it basically says FruitEdit. It basically binds the role FruitEdit, which allows you to edit fruits, to the user Susie. Okay, so that's it. So that's it for the administrator role. So now Susie wants to get to work, and she wants to be able to now edit the fruit, right? So she's gonna log in. So here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna switch windows, right? And here I'm gonna switch to now a different credential. I'm gonna log in as Susie, not Susie Administrator, and then we're gonna do some tests with that. So let me pause the video and switch users real quick. Okay, I'm back. So I logged in as Susie, and we can validate that by running that STS get caller identity. And you can see indeed I'm Susie now. Okay, so Susie, let's try one thing first. Let's do a failure first. So cube control, I'm going to try to do a delete operation on the config map fruit in the namespace A. So if all works right, this should fail because Susie doesn't actually have a delete verb on that, right? So she can't do it. On the other hand, she can do an edit. And she can add in, for example, C cantaloupe. I think that's how you spell cantaloupe. And she can save it, and then she describe it. So that's saved. So describe CM fruit. Must have missed this. Describe. And you can see indeed now I have A, apple, B, banana, C, cantaloupe. So she's able to edit it. She didn't delete it because we didn't give her delete rights, right? So the last thing we're going to do is we're going to log in as Dave and see what he can do or cannot do, right? So let me switch windows. I'm going to switch here. Let me pause the video while I switch. Okay, we're back. So now I am logged in as Dave, right? So if you recall, Dave should only be able to read things that are in the namespace A, but not edit anything because we didn't grant any particular edit rights. So we can validate a couple things here. So first thing we can do is we can validate that you can read the config map. So if I do AWS, kube control get config map. Let's see, get config map fruit. Well, I'll just get any config map in the namespace A. So he sees the fruit, and then he can also describe it. He should be able to describe it. Describe config map fruit in namespace A. And then he can see it. But now the question is, can he edit it? Right? Because Susie can edit it. Now what's a little confusing here is you think, oh, he can edit it because I'm in the editor screen. I don't know the D fruit, so dog, I don't know. So let me try to save this. And you notice that it gives an error, could not be patched because Dave doesn't have that right? So it tells you exactly what's wrong, and you can see that the fruit is unchanged. There's no D entry. Okay, so that illustrates kind of a full flow where just the big picture of this whole thing was, as an administrator, a cluster administrator, we went through the exercise of creating a new namespace and then creating the infrastructure so that we can delegate both a administrator role and developer role to that namespace. And then our HR team, which was really just still Fred administrator, basically created the users, right, and associated them to the two groups, right? And then we learned about roles and why they were different than cluster roles. Mostly it's so that the SUSE administrator, the delegated user, could actually do something, right? It doesn't add any new features other than the fact that someone can actually do it. And then as SUSE administrator, we imagined that she needed to create a new object, in this case a config map, and then she wanted to delegate the ability to maybe work with that object, and so she used a role and a role binding to give the SUSE user the ability to edit it, right? We illustrated that SUSE could indeed edit it, but she couldn't delete it because we didn't give her delete rights. And then we just messed around with Dave and just illustrated that because he had access to read anything in the namespace, he could read the fruit config map, but he couldn't edit it because he wasn't granted any rights other than just whatever the read rights he got for the whole namespace. So that's it for the video today.